So today I'll be talking about civic algorithms as a digital intermediation challenge. And I wanted to preface this by saying, when I'm talking about cultural production, I use that term broadly for media texts. And just earlier I was talking to a colleague about, I've been prompted or reminded of the importance of media for democracy in preparation for this presentation today. So although they're not always connected in that kind of hand-in-hand type of scenario, we very much do have we dance the same moves at many times when we're talking media studies and deliberative democracy at least. I too would just like to take a moment to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people on which the campus is built on, and extend my respect to all the elders past, present and emerging. As David did mention, and I thought I would take the opportunity to mention it here as well, it's finally here after years of writing and collaborating and lockdowns and COVIDs and all sorts of things that we've all been through recently. The book is actually out in physical form or digital form, and Routledge have generously provided me a 20% discount that I can offer to anyone who may be interested in purchasing. So if you just follow that QR code, it'll take you to a website. You can purchase the book there and get 20% off. We'll come back to that a little bit later. To start off, I wanted to prompt you thinking about levers. And so in a pre-Spotify era, when things weren't recommended to us so often, this app emerged, which was sort of a plugin for Spotify, and was created by Vince Neilstein, and it's the Earache Metalizer app. And he says it generates custom metal playlists that draw from all the metal available on Spotify, not just earache releases. Users can adjust 4 sliders: metal, death, thrash, and grind. And for the metal heads that aren't in the room today, are very like subgenres of that particular kind of music, depending on how much of each subgenre they want in their playlist. And then the 5th slider, determining the number of tracks in the playlist, press the metalize button and a playlist materializes before your eyes. So it's this really interesting demonstration of how users have agency over their own space, in which now is very much automated or at arm's length from how we can control these sorts of spaces. And that sort of sets the pace for a number of automated or indeed algorithmically driven spaces that we are part of in our everyday life. And so today I wanted to try and unpack that as what I'm seeing as probably one of our most pressing issues around generative AI, given the scale and uptake of generative AI in this space. And thinking about this from the perspective of the glass is half full, you know, can we use this for social good? I think a lot of people are quite critical, and we hear a lot of the negative talk around generative AI, and that will be very well documented in the years to come. But I wonder if we can reposition ourselves at this stage to think about how generative AI might be useful in a range of scenarios, including civic algorithms. So again, just recapping, you know, this is a result of our increasingly automated decision-making processes within our digital environments of our everyday existences. But I wonder, you know, is there a way that we can enter into this conversation at this point and think about this as a social good, as opposed to a data scraping exercise, as it is often referred to. And also, one of the things, the undertow of this presentation that I hope we can kind of pick up on and unpack a little bit further, is any of this new? I think we're just coming to another media technology where we've had the moral panic, or maybe we're still in the midst of that. But I think we know what we're doing in this space, and I think it's worth unpacking some of our historical challenges and bringing that into this space as a way to try and understand how we might approach generative AI as a form of civic algorithms. So to unpack this and start with a view or a lens in which to look at civic algorithms. Let's start with something like digital intermediation, which is drawing on some of my most recent work, which is obviously in the book. So to give you an overview, a lot of these are unseen infrastructures, right? And so here's typically what would happen in a social media environment at any given moment. 450 hours of content per minute on YouTube, 400 million tweets per, or let's call, are they X's now? Xing maybe per day. WeChat, 1.09 billion monthly users. TikTok is just enormous, as I'm sure we're all aware as well. And so often this is kind of a process of platforms, regulations, commercial imperatives, content created, automated calculations in a milieu of interactions with each other at any given point in time. So if we want to unpack this a little bit further, a way that we can understand digital intermediation is through these aspects: technology, agencies, and automation. So it's this combination of these three areas that is what I argue is digital intermediation as an unseen infrastructure. So the things that we can't physically touch. Again, levers is kind of a takeaway here. So if we think about technologies, reasonably straightforward, the sorts of things like our phones, our computers, our desktops, drone sensors, et cetera, but also interoperability as a process between these technologies. So for example, databases talking to other databases. An API, an application program interface, is a really good example of something like this, where one technology opens up a particular aspect of it to enable another piece of technology to connect and work. And often this is seamless. Most times it's not. And again, this also introduces a whole new area of contestation around the intermediation process for cultural production. And of course, interfaces and databases are also something to consider within the technology space as well. Agencies or institutions are also something that can really impact in this space as well. And often these are the spaces that operate between, say, content creators, and that's a broad term for all sorts of media texts, and audiences within this space as well. So the example that I've got here is Happiness Saigon, just having returned from a field research trip in Ho Chi Minh City. Working with Happiness Saigon was a really interesting way of trying to understand how commercial activity can operate within a country which is a one-party state, and it was really enlightening actually to see how they're doing such an exceptional job of enabling voice and enabling communication within a system that we would question the democracy capacity in that particular country. But essentially it's something like a multi-channel network, which is what Stuart Cunningham and David Craig have often spoken about in their work. SMEs built up on technological networking and commercial affordances of multiple, rapidly scaling, near frictionless global social media platforms, for example, YouTube, Facebook, Snapchat, and Twitch. And often talking to content creators in this space, they do talk about the way that they operate efficiently. And so they can do so much in their social media spaces, but they will get to a point where they kind of tap out, they max out their visibility. And it's at this point that they come to this particular digital intermediation process and connect with multi-channel networks, for example, who often have within their crew someone who champions a particular network, at which point they can say, if you want greater visibility, you need to be thinking about X, Y, Z. And that can be hashtags or content or whatever it might be, the functionalities of those particular agencies. And again, this sort of comes through with genuine user engagement in these spaces. Finally, for digital intermediation, thinking through automation. And so what we do know, it's often in a critical lens that I think people talk about automation. So Julie Thomas has done some great work here around intelligent technologies. And of course, there's been a lot of work done around the bias of automation in this space, which I think is incredibly important to look at, particularly from the perspective of non-Western voices. So Sophia Noble did that fantastic book around inbuilt bias within algorithms. Tanya Bucha has done some great work around the if this then that process and how it's inbuilt. The design of these particular mechanisms are inherently racist or biased or discriminatory, which is kind of all built on how these machines learn and operate within these sorts of spaces. On the other side of the equation, though, it's also helpful to remember that automation is, as Michelle Wilson would say, a sense-making machine or a sense-making process, in that there's a lot of data out there, a lot of content based on some of those stats that I put up before about social media, especially. There is no way in anyone's lifetime will we get through any of the content that's on YouTube or Instagram or Snapchat or whatever. So we need these kinds of functionalities and technologies to not only engage with these kinds of spaces, but to also help us to make sense of what we're seeing and engaging with there as well. At the end of the day, it's all about content visibility. So there's a glut of media texts out there, and in various ways, there's users and content creators who are what Sophia Bishop would say is gaming the system in terms of visibility, so increasing visibility. And that is understanding how algorithms work, how interfaces work, technologies, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really all about this content visibility space. It's a way for, as Bourdieu would talk about it, a way to transfer value from one cultural text or one group of cultural text to another group with that same cultural text. It also enables us to think through things like media diversity. So if there's only one way of making sense in these kinds of spaces, what are we to think of in terms of media diversity? How do we ensure that all sorts of voices are included in this kind of space? How do we engage with different conversations around this sort of space? And of course, then that starts to impact how we understand our worlds around us, our societies, and ultimately how we approach our democracies within this kind of environment as well. So it's a combination of bringing all of these processes together within that digital intermediation space to not only understand how content production is made or how particular mechanisms or levers are pulled and pushed to direct how content creators might operate in that space, but then also how it's distributed, published and distributed in these digital environments, and then also consumed by audience members as well. So, and when we apply that process to whatever aspect it might be, whether it's high entertainment value content such as the Women's World Cup at the moment, doing exceptionally well in, getting a high visibility count in a number of spaces, through to a kazoo player who wants to meet up with other people in his area that he might be interested in or whatever. Or a range of issues then become possible to understand when we think of it through this digital intermediation approach. Just coming back to media diversity here, I think there's a point to be made about digital ability and who we are within our own agency within these spaces. And I think typically we don't have a great understanding of the sorts of digital abilities of users within these kind of digital environments. There is some great work emerging though. The Australian Digital Inclusion Index, I think, is always a fantastic reminder of how various skill levels are changing and adapting year on year. I would also point to Agata Stepnik, who's been doing work around user agency, who's just completed her PhD on this work as well, where she found there's quite a range of implications for how users engage their agency and try to almost not game the system, but understand and operate within the system so that they're accessing the information that they want. And so it's interesting to say that here that there's a disconnect between what's happening in this kind of highly promoted, streamlined content production, entertainment industry, news, journalism, whatever it might be over here, and where our audiences and users are sitting. There's still this disconnect. And for those who have a high digital ability, I think they can navigate these spaces quite well. For those who are less able in that space, there's a huge issue to address there. I'll come back to this in a second, but I think public service media are probably a very important group of cultural institutions to keep in mind. So moving away from kind of the lens here of digital intermediation and more in towards our contemporary moment of generative AI. So I think it really is a pressing issue for us at the moment. And this is because of the rapid uptake. And I'm assuming that a number of people in here have gone through teaching moments in the last 12 to 24 months where ChatGPT came out and education innovation people just kind of went, oh my God, it's the end of everything that we know of. A number of documents, certainly in the University of Sydney space, documents keep flowing about how to work with generative AI. So there's this moment of panic, yes, but also rapid uptake from users in this kind of space as well. So we can see that they're getting really quite clever at what they do. And I think AI, as problematic as that term is, also aligns in that, like VR, I put AI and virtual reality in that same kind of space where every couple of years it has this resurgence of like, is this it? This is the one, isn't it? We're all going to be walking around with goggles on our heads soon because it's, that's what and it never eventuates. But AI in this instance, maybe this is the moment where it really does take a strong hold of how material content is created, impacting further on that digital intermediation relationship that I outlined earlier. We're facing a similar moment with the capacity of generative AI compared with social media, where it can either be an amazing tool or a catastrophic disaster. So I think that's where we're currently at the moment, is which road are we going to take? Are we going to win or are we going to lose? Just to bring us all up to spec with generative AI, and of course, I'm not a computer scientist, so I will not go into depth in detail here, but just to outline sort of a broad overview, as I'm sure most people in the room and Zoom have used these kinds of tools in the past. ChatGPT, OpenAI's GPT 3.5 is a language processing model. DALL-E, Midjourney, these are all sort of the really popular applications that people have been using in the last little while to either generate text or images or whatever it might be. But at the core of these AI machines is a model which is designed and built by people, implemented with machine learning to keep generating intelligence of sorts. Something like language translation, text completion, and creative writing are all the sorts of applications that we've seen so far. In a conversation last week to one of our technical staff at USyd, he was saying that he doesn't write how-to manuals anymore for students and staff. It's really just coming into something like ChatGPT and can you write me that's a good use, I think, of this sort of space. One of the things that I think is worth bringing up today, given its immediacy of its news, importance and significance at the moment, is the change to the terms and services of Zoom, of which we are all in right now, where they have now changed their the terms of service to say that they can consent, that you as the user consent to Zoom using any of the content in this space, including for the purposes of training and tuning of algorithms and models. Now, what that means at this point, I think, is still unclear. But to me, it feels like we're back in the wild, wild west again of media technologies, where someone goes, here's what we can do, amazing, imagine what we can do with that, and they run it out without really giving it much of a thought of the implications of the broader impact of it. Needless to say, a number of consumer rights people, media and law folk, internet researchers are up in a furor at the moment around how this is, how this would emerge and what the implications, what the extent of this means, and the sorts of implications that it brings as well. So some good, some potentially not so good. Potentially also just a warning to check your Zoom settings before you do anything from this point forward. Switching tack to the journalism space, I think conversational journalism is an interesting environment to start to think about, particularly in the democracy space, where it is a complex environment in which this good and evil battle is taking place right now in terms of how we understand the environment to be operating. So just to give you a very quick overview, some emerging research that I'm working on at the moment, we sort of work through a number of probably about, I think it was about 30 to 40 news bots, so chat bots that are specifically looking at news. We focused in on 16 of those, where the most interesting ones were Artifact, ABC Newsbot, The Newsroom, and Charlie. And what we did find with a lot of it is that it's rare to have absolute automation in these spaces. And then in talking with Craig McCosker, who's one of the key journalist technical people from the ABC Newsbot, he highlighted some of the issues around that in terms of editorial is incredibly important in this space, which is something that just really can't be automated. He went a little bit further to talk about the legal implications as well, where a journalist will write a story and there's a right of reply inherently inbuilt into that piece of text. Whereas when we step into this automated space, that might not necessarily be the case. And so legal teams working within the news space are very on high alert. Excuse me. So it is this blend of automation and editorial at the same time. But of course, it's really clunky. It's still at that stage where you can, hi Charlie, what's going on? Can you show me the news? And it'll give you some headlines and aggregate something together. And then there'll be a point where you sort of go, are threads useful? At this point, when I did this, Instagram had just released threads and it was like, everyone was talking about it. And I asked Charlie, are threads useful? And just kind of, that sort of thing. So, but the point to make here is that I think these sorts of technologies are crucial for people working in journalism in that sort of space, as it does enable you to find new audiences. So that reach is really quite important. And it's this process that enables the contextualization and the translation of news, which is not always easy for a broad range of audience members. Excuse me. So just to enter the third phase of today's talk. What are the problems within generative AI that we know of? So, of course, there's a lack of transparency. We don't know how these systems work, but if we did know, could the everyday person really, would it mean anything to them? I know that I wouldn't have any idea of what to do with code, but there is very much this kind of black box scenario emerging again around these sorts of technologies. At the moment, particularly with things like Midjourney and DALL-E, ethics and moral rights are the focus, and that's in terms of people are creating content, and these models are essentially search engines that are scraping broad spaces and repurposing artworks in that way. So artists are kind of saying, hey, where do I get my my 2 cents in there. And of course, it brings in new business models around that, which of course the tech bros are sort of clamping down and trying to make their own space, which I thought was interesting when a few of them got together and were the champions of slowing down the whole generative AI race. It's interesting. But again, just returning back to this, none of this is new. Like we've seen these problems emerge again and again and again, from internet to social media to platformization. They're all the same kinds of things that are starting to emerge. And the policy design rarely keeps step with what's going on. So one of the things that has just emerged in the last little while is the safe and responsible AI submissions, which probably a number of people in here have submitted to as well. As part of our University of Sydney submission, one of the things I wanted to highlight here was the thinking around impact assessment, which I think is a really important point that it's never happened before. And I think a lot of the time the technology bolts and the policy follows, which is, you would expect that. But it's kind of always in how do we stop these bad things from happening, instead of, well, we've tested this and we know that it's okay, so let's release it to the publics or whatever. So this was one of the strong focal points of our submission to the government around, thinking about, well, how do we assess the impact of these kinds of technologies before saying, yes, it's great to go, or, whatever. We're all listening to watching Kim Kardashian or whatever. So how might we, well, look, what do we know at the moment, and how are we going to prevent these sorts of unsocial cohesions? So again, we've learnt these problems from the media technologies that have gone before us. So how is AI any different? The moral rights at the start, but I think it's much more deeper than that in terms of policy and regulation that understands technology. So it's not just about, identifying the technology and then going, okay, so 13-year-olds are using social media in this particular way that we didn't really expect. It's very much about having people who speak that language within the policy design space. I think is crucial. At the heart of this is digital intermediation. So understanding that process of what I'm saying, cultural production here, it applies broadly to a whole range of media texts and the sorts of implications that flow on from that sort of space as well. Again, increased user agency for things like civic algorithms is really important. So when these kinds of technologies emerge, it is this black box that comes to the user, and then we kind of try and work it out, where a number of the outcomes are already predetermined. So increasing that user agency is really important for civic algorithms and the impact that has on our democracies. And this is the point where I think cultural institutions become significant to include in this conversation. So here I'm talking about public service media, where they have this a chartered or a regulated, a legal remit to do particular things within a media system. So within Australia, we have the ABC and the SBS. They have to educate, inform, and entertain. Where some of our colleagues here have gone a little bit further to talk about the sorts of things that they do within the European context. And a lot of these, like the focal point of a lot of this remit is to be at the forefront of media technologies, engage audiences, include voices, all of the good things that combine or contribute to social cohesion. So if we've got this technology coming out, it just makes sense to me that public service media are some of the champions of this particular space. So again, just returning back to the metallizer or the ABCizer, if we might want to think about it that way, it's this lack of these sorts of levers that really impact on our civic algorithms as they emerge over the coming time, where I think what we need to be thinking about is increased transparency. How do these things work and what's the impact of them? User agency, who are we within these sorts of technologies and media spaces? And then again, this consistent impact assessment. So before these technologies are actually released into the wild and the publics, we know what's going to happen with them. And it's not just Meta telling us that it's great and whatever. It's a considered approach towards these sorts of media technologies. At that point, I will end and say thank you.